All right, Mark Mirra here with Aligned, and we're going to interview Deven here. Deven comes in with a ton of experience in global commercial negotiation from animal health, animal nutrition industry, which is typically a male-dominated industry. And what's really cool about Deven is not only does she have amazing commercial and global commercial chops when it comes to negotiation, but she's also doing a lot of research, doctoral research on the topic of negotiation, specifically how some research studies get it right, which research studies get it wrong, and how negotiation bleeds and blends across gender, culture, and everything in between. So we're super excited for this conversation that we have with Deven. Deven, welcome in.
Thanks, Mark. I'm really excited to be here and to work with Aligned and have this conversation today.
Awesome. So Deven, you've been doing a ton of research in the field of negotiation. If you can just give us maybe some top line understanding on everything that you've learned in the research that you've done, and maybe how that has either validated or invalidated some of the personal experiences that you've had in your roles.
Yeah, for sure. I'm Deven Vespi. Like Mark said, I'm currently doing my research at the Paris School of Business. I'm getting a doctorate in business focusing on negotiation. I've been in the commercial animal health, animal nutrition segment for about, almost 15 years now. And the last role I had, I was a global lead, and I got to have some really interesting experiences going around the world, negotiating with different cultures, and then being in a more male-dominated field. And when I would go around, one of the more interesting things, Mark, is I kind of wanted this, like when I started really negotiating for this large corporation, which call out, I actually did a really cool negotiation training with Aligned at that corporation, and it was one of the most impactful experiences, and I learned so much, and I would highly recommend it to any organization. And I still go back and look at my notes, and now me and Mark just get to talk and chat, which is fun. But when I first started working for this company and I was going around doing negotiations, I remember I went to one of the global leaders and I was like, all right, what's the deal? When I go to the Netherlands or I go to Australia, or if I'm speaking to an Asian country, how do I negotiate? And they basically told me to figure it out. And so I had this experience of trying to figure out how to negotiate in different cultures, and then to have to negotiate in different situations and groups. And I tended to be one of the only females in the room. And this experience for me, I was okay, and I was able to adapt pretty quickly, which I was lucky, but it made me realize there's a big gap. And one of the reasons I figured there was a gap is I started looking at the negotiation literature. I'm a nerd. So I like research, I like science, and so I just started trying to see if there's some literature published around kind of this interesting problem as a woman, going to maybe negotiate in Texas compared to the Netherlands, compared to Mexico or Canada. Overall, I had been working in different negotiations for over 20 countries, and basically there wasn't a lot of literature. And I was experiencing specific things that we'll talk about, like backlash or kind of pressures to behave one way or another, depending on who I was negotiating in front of. And it just made me really curious about what I should be doing, and how, if there is somebody at one stage in my career I might mentor, how I could tell them how to really manage or deal with these different type of negotiations. And so I started my research, and I'm currently 1 year into my doctoral research. And what I'm really focusing on is looking at business-to-business negotiations. Mark, as you and I know, business-to-business negotiations is really how the world runs. Those are huge negotiations. They're multi-round. And the first thing I noticed when I was starting to look into my doctoral research is most research on negotiation are one round negotiations that are done at a business school or in college. So that wasn't very helpful. It wasn't very relevant to what I was experiencing. And then on top of that, I was really curious about, as a woman, if I start advocating for my company or my firm, do I get a reduction in something called backlash, which we can talk about, backlash is basically you kind of have these prescribed roles as a gender depending on your culture of how you should behave. And if you jump outside of those roles, you can get backlash. So I was curious, if I start advocating and kind of almost be like motherly for my company, do I have an advantage? Because I'm all about negotiation advantage. And then on top of that, depending on the culture, things even switch. Like in China, women tend to be more aggressive. The really good negotiators are women, and that's acceptable in that culture. So I was just really curious Like, depending on the culture, depending on the framing of the negotiation, and depending on real world negotiations, so multi-round, if I could find some themes that then could help guide me and then others.
I agree. Obviously, I also like being a nerd. So I read a bunch of research papers as well.
Yeah.
And what you'll notice if anyone reads any literature on negotiation, when Deven talks about one round versus multi-round, much of the research is done in a lab environment, which makes a lot of sense. You need to control for variables, between two individuals that generally don't know each other, negotiating over a item or series of items in a transactional way, so a one-time transaction. These negotiations, again, since it needs to be a controlled environment, which makes a lot of sense from a research standpoint, you want to control as many different alternative variables as you can. You're typically negotiating over quantitative 2 to 3 things. So price, volume, delivery, price, volume, payment terms. It's easy to assess the ZOPA, or the bargaining range, when you do that, and it's easy to quantify who succeeds and who fails based on the available value. Now that's fine, right? Personal negotiations tend to skew transactional, one-off, with strangers you're not going to interact with before. So that's cool. But what that doesn't do is talk about what business-to-business negotiations are, which are repeat occurrences, reoccurring deals, long-term agreements across a series of terms or variables that can be quantitative as well as qualitative. The research is very, very hard to administer in those types of environments because there's a lot of other factors at play. So that's a bit of an overview on the negotiation stage as it is right now. And that's why you see a lot of tactics out there in the marketplace, like anchoring, opening aggressive, mirroring, that work in stranger dynamics, transactional deals with very few quantitative terms. It works incredibly well there. But from a B2B standpoint, as we've seen in our experience, and I've trained thousands and thousands of people at this point, we've worked in 25, 30 different countries, hundreds of different organizations, all up and down the food chain. They're different. These are different circumstances with people that know each other, they're familiar, information is more readily accessible, terms and contracts are much wider. So that's why there's this big gap. So Deven, when you were going into thinking about your research, how did you reconcile the research that's already out there to the research that you're aspiring to do?
That's such a good question. And also just want to call out that I love that you're like a practitioner who looks at the research and then has a real world experience. That's really kind of like what we need in negotiations. So I just really appreciate it.
Of course.
And it's a really good question. There's some really interesting data from the negotiation literature. There's some really cool stuff as a woman, right? As just when it comes to multi-round negotiations, but all from a very specific standpoint that's not real world, like you said, for what we're dealing with. There was a really cool meta-analysis that came out in 2022, and this meta-analysis basically looked at all of negotiation literature, or a significant amount, and said there's a huge gap. Everything is way too impersonal. There's not those relationships. There's not multi-round. It's not something that's going on for, 10 years, 15 years. And I think that totally changes the game. If I was company A and you're company B, and we are negotiating, if we've known each other for, 5 years, and we're going to negotiate for 5, 10 more years, we're going to behave so differently. Right? We're going to establish trust. We're going to be honest. We're really going to try to have intentions to work together in the future and show signals of collaboration. And it's an interesting aspect because generally, even in the gender confines of what's expected for women or men in an individualistic society like the US, women are expected to be a little bit more collaborative overall. But that's where you want to be collaborative. Could you imagine if we had to negotiate for the next 5 years and I was a total jerk and I came in really hot, really aggressive? And there's even research that's come out recently showing that if you start a negotiation very aggressively and it is multi-round, you're going to hurt yourself. You might get a good outcome the first time, but if you have to negotiate with somebody multiple times, the people are going to have almost no tolerance, and it's really hard to get out of a transactional behavior, very aggressive, and then go to collaborative. And so I found that really interesting, and you're the expert of that. I mean, some of the stuff that we talked about in your training that I underwent was all about that.
Yeah, listen, at the end of the day, trust takes a really long time to build and very, very quickly to break. And what we found is the exact same thing. You will have aggressive negotiators go in and get I wouldn't say great deal necessarily the first time, but they get really solid deals consistently on the first interaction because no one's used to them. And some people have been kind of born and raised with those traditional, I say traditional as in air quotes here, of manipulative, intimidating, bullying, slam my fist on the table tactics that did work 20, 40, 60, 100 plus years ago when physical intimidation was a legitimate thing.
Yeah.
But they work a lot differently today because we have repeat interactions, we have a globalized economy. So relationships are paramount. So some of these hyper transactional interactions, where again, you see in the marketplace anchoring, you see aggressive openers or opening extreme, they work really well in these kind of one-off instances. But in multi-round negotiations, where you're dealing with the same person on a recurring basis, they work usually once, maybe twice. And after that, people will stop giving you things, they'll stop opening up, they'll shut down. And when legitimate or perceived power shifts in their favor, so away from this person to their counterparty is going to hit them 2 to 3 times harder because now they want to claw everything back. So you see this big transition into collaborative negotiation away from transactional negotiation, and transactional negotiation is where most of the research sits. Evan, in your experience, kind of what changes from round 1 to round 5 plus in some of your interactions in a negotiation? And then we'll start transitioning the conversation to talk more about how gender norms and cultural norms may impact that too.
Well, it's a really good question. I'm going to go a little bit off literature because at this point, there's not the literature I'm finding around multi-round negotiations isn't as strong. So, but my own personal experience, what I've experienced from maybe round 1 to round 5, where I've had success, is building up trust, being very honest and direct and collaborative. And really, instead of like never splitting the difference, that, that term, it's like you actually are, right? You are working together for the betterment of both organizations. And that's when I've had experiences in my career where perhaps I didn't have as much leverage, but I've built up enough trust that the people I'm negotiating with will actually try to help me. They will come to the table and try to help the negotiation or give more than they should because I've had this big built up of trust, right? I've really focused on the relationship. I've really understood what they need, what their business is looking for, where they're going. And I think the other really beneficial thing is as you continue every negotiation, you can learn more. If you ask the right questions, you sit and listen, and you are respectful, you can learn more and more about what they want. And then you can also go behind the people that you're working with and get them along. Because right, when it comes to business negotiations, it's just not you and the person sitting across the table. It's also everyone behind you, everyone ahead of you, the VP, the director. But I think really building that trust and learning as much as possible and just asking a lot of questions is what I've seen really increase the level of trust. Where other times I've seen other negotiators, like you said, they might get something good one time, and then it's a full downward spiral and there's almost no way to recover.
Yeah, and so let's talk about that I can get one solid deal, maybe 2 solid deals, but eventually once bitten, twice shy, where if I'm too aggressive too many times, they're going to shift me down to being a more transactional business partner. And listen, if that's part of my strategy, then cool, but that's usually not part of your strategy to be considered a transactional business partner or transactional supplier, vendor, customer, whatever.
Yeah.
A lot of people aspire to be much more strategic. A lot of people aspire to develop great partnerships. And it's incredibly hard to do that if your mindset is to be really transactional. So you have to build trust. Now let's talk about, again, from a research standpoint, multi-round negotiations are also difficult to evaluate because when you have high trust and you have high collaboration and you move from bargaining tactics to more creating or partnering tactics, walk-away points, the ZOPA, the bargaining range, they become less of a thing. I'm open to challenging and breaking the status quo because you're open to challenging and breaking the status quo. So I don't know as a researcher how I'm supposed to reconcile that from a points standpoint or a value standpoint or a percent capture of the bargaining range standpoint when walkaway points are now broken and shattered. So one of the biggest hallmarks of collaborative negotiation versus transactional is we have this ability to create a bigger pie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that in and of itself becomes hard to evaluate in a lab environment. So that's one of the challenges I'm sure you'll see and you'll solve when it comes to the research you're doing and all the different interviews you're doing. Because that's, I think, a very needed aspect of the marketplace, because the overwhelming majority of the research, the books, the tactics skew transactional, likely personal one-off negotiations.
I don't know if I'll solve it, but maybe I'll be able to understand it a little bit more. And just a shout out, if anyone wants to be part of my research, I am trying to find people to interview. But I hope to be able to understand it a little bit more and just be able to give some people an easier time on understanding it. Because it's a lot of learning by fire. The amount of weird experiences or times I have messed up trying to learn. My favorite is for sure being yelled at in German. Like that was like a good experience.
Yeah, if you haven't been yelled at least once or twice negotiating, you probably didn't push hard enough or try something different. To be fair, but we're always here to learn something. We talk a lot internally at Aligned here. I either learn something or I gain something. Mm-hmm. I would like to be right or be corrected, because in both instances I've gained something or learned something. So I think that's really valuable for anyone out there. Be open to making mistakes, be open to being vulnerable, and feeding back on yourself is critically important. Let's transition to the topic, because I want to learn a little bit more about how you're looking at gender and culture. And to set that up, in our experience, in my experience, negotiation is different across genders and cultures because communication is different. And I want to hear some of your thoughts on this. When we think about communication here at Aligned, miscommunication is a bunch of bullshit. We don't think it exists. There are misunderstandings and there are misinterpretations. They are both different things as well. So a misunderstanding is I'm saying something to you, you have no idea really what I said, you're confused, but you're too shy to say anything about it, so you kind of just walk away with a level of vagueness and ambiguity. Then there's misinterpretations. You hear exactly what I said, but you're fundamentally different than what my intention was. So in our opinion, effective communication happens when intent and interpretation are exactly the same. Now, if we bridge that into genders and cultures, there are certain norms on how people communicate, which we believe impacts negotiation. So Deven, I would love your perspective on gender, culture, communication, negotiation, and some of the findings you've been finding with your research. Yeah,
thanks, Mark. I'll say it's interesting, as a pretty outspoken and direct woman, looking into negotiation literature versus men and women, overall, there's a slight advantage for men. And a lot of the research that I've seen, caveat, most of them are looking at individualistic societies. And that's a very frustrating thing. When I first started reading about that, it was really frustrating to see from a literature perspective, because I've also seen some of the best negotiators ever be females, and I've gotten some things out of negotiations that I was really proud of, and I think I had an advantage being a woman. But one of the things specifically if we talk about gender first, when it comes to negotiation, and just because I'm saying it, I don't think it's right, just to be clear. I don't think there should be a difference between genders. I don't think it makes me sad that there are, but the literature has shown, and my real world experience has shown me that right now that's where we are. And so the first big thing that I'd want to talk about is something called role congruity. It's a theory that came out of research where it's one of the things where things can be misinterpreted, or there can be just an issue where there's just an expectation within my gender role as a female on how I should behave, which is really communal. So I'm going to be warm and cooperative, whereas a man has an expectation, right? This is making it very black and white. It's not how it is, but men are supposed to be more agenic, so assertive and competitive. And when you go in as a woman, and also, generally speaking, in a negotiation, if you're more assertive, you get a better outcome. When you're looking at one-shot negotiations, and maybe even perhaps longer-term negotiations, but so there's this kind of like boundary as a woman called role congruity theory, or role congruity, where you really need to be communal and warm. But what happens in a negotiation is if you do that, you can actually be perceived as like not very competent. And if you go outside of the norms, what happens is actually something called backlash. And it's this social penalty that women receive for assertive behavior that violates the expected female gender role. And these two things together, when women are negotiating, can make it really hard. Because I'm a pretty direct, aggressive female. So I've experienced it where I can be very direct, and all of a sudden I get this backlash from people where they're like, oh man, she's being this or she's being that. And then I can see the person sitting next to me is yelling in the negotiation, and I'm saying please, and I'm like, what is happening here? And unfortunately, it's something research has shown, and I'm actually going to pause because I'm really curious what's your experience in this.
So in my experience, I agree with the same philosophies you have, right? I fundamentally believe both genders are equally capable in pretty much doing everything. But there are societal expectations on how people show up. Mm-hmm. Our golden rule, you talk about assertiveness, our golden rule when it comes to communicators, let alone negotiators, is clear, assertive, respectful. Clear in your expectations, clear in your needs, the ability to deliver those assertively, firm, tough, straightforward, and you can do it in a respectful and professional way to ensure that the person on the other end interprets your intent the exact way you want it to be interpreted, right? We talk about assume positive intent all the time. I've mentioned be nice twice, but assertiveness has to be a recipe for every single individual in the world to be able to communicate with clarity, assertiveness, and respect. That bleeds into negotiation. And you're right, we have these norms. I've seen the same thing. I've seen a lot of women specifically perceive themselves as less capable negotiators, and then I feel like there's a bit of self-fulfilling prophecy in that instance where I perceive myself as not being able to be assertive, so I will come in more either collaborating or compromising or even accommodating if maybe I grew up in a household in which I was expected to accommodate. Yeah. And then that shows up in my negotiations. So I have a harder time being assertive because my entire personal life has been structured in an accommodated way. So that is what I've seen. But what I've also seen is it has absolutely no bearing on competence.
100%.
So I think it's more of as a society or in societies, if there are perceived and structured gender norms, that bleeds into negotiation. You mentioned, some Asian cultures, women are incredibly assertive and capable negotiators, even in transactional settings, because in those societies that is the norm on how they communicate and how they show up, and it doesn't come off offensive. But other cultures, that obviously is very different. So I have seen some differences in culture. I've seen some differences in gender, although the differences in gender are less reason of the gender and more reason of the societal norms that culture has. But also in my experience training these individuals, it has absolutely no bearing on capability whatsoever.
I implicitly agree with, there's no bearing on capability. It's just these constructs that personally I want to break through. But there have been, if there's women watching this right now, this is where if I speak to a woman leader or an executive and I start saying some of the experiences I've had in negotiations where I've been told to smile more or when I
hate that.
I know, or I deliver bad news. I've delivered, in a negotiation, the realities of the situation. And they're like, you really need to deliver it more positively. And I was like, what do you mean? And so there's this it's an interesting experience. And one of my hopes and my hypothesis actually with my research is there's something else, and it's called advocacy. In literature, it's been shown, even with these confines of a woman in an individualistic culture, really need to kind of be more communal, to not have backlash. There's a lot of literature showing that if a woman is advocating, normally the literature is if a woman is advocating for their family or for somebody else, they can be very assertive. And they don't have backlash, and they then are actually within their social gender norms because they're kind of they're protecting their family. So my hypothesis, because some of the best negotiators I've seen are women. Not that there's amazing negotiators, on both genders. And I'm always curious, how did they get there? And I think there's part of my hypothesis is that if you start advocating for a firm or an organization, you really as a woman can also step outside of kind of your role, or generally your gender role, because you're still actually in it, because you're protecting your firm, if that makes sense. And so it's one of the things I want to look into. But it's a frustrating thing to read in literature, but it is something I've experienced, and I agree. Capability, there's nothing between either gender. It's just if you're trustworthy, if you are assertive, if you're honest. But the other really interesting thing that I've seen, if we're going to shift to culture, because I would even say it's not really on gender. It's on the culture you are in.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So we're in an individualistic culture. So like Germany, the US, Italy, and then there's more of communal cultures. So a lot of the Asian countries, some countries in South America. And there's also, some cultures are very intense about staying within confines, called like tight cultures. There's a really cool study that was actually published in 2011 on the Journal of Science about loose and tight cultures. And like the US is a loose culture and we're individualistic. So we can kind of, that's where if you kind of advocate in a business setting as a female, you can kind of jump outside of your gender norms because it's a little bit of a loose culture and you're still kind of in a way advocating based on your norms. Whereas a tight culture, so like India, China, South Korea, these cultures, they're generally are more communal, and then they have a tight way of kind of going about how they reprimand anyone who steps outside. And actually, my favorite thing, have you ever been in Japan?
Yeah, we were there a couple of years ago. Loved it. Obsessed.
Well, and one of my favorite parts about Japan, and I have so much respect, is culturally everyone really is aligned, right? Like if everyone's on time for the train, you do not, like you feel this social pressure. I remember there's no way I would ever jaywalk in Japan, right? Nope. In LA, 100%. In Japan, you feel the pressure right away, and that's kind of what it means. It's a very tight culture. And then when you're thinking about a communal culture, things shift. It's actually a little bit more expected for men to be nice and cooperative, and especially when it comes to B2C settings, women can be hyper aggressive. If you go to China and you negotiate with a woman and a shop owner, they're gonna decimate you. And I love it, and there's research showing they are so good at negotiating, and it's within their gender roles. So I would say it is culture. I mean, it's gender, but it's not. It's really the culture you're in and how intense they are on trying to keep people within their roles. And so that's positive. That makes me happy, but now it's just how to guide negotiators with that complex framework.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. There are gender norms within culture. And I totally agree that it has absolutely nothing to do with clarity, capability, consistency. Every person's a little bit different. And if you are raised multiculturally or you've traveled a ton, you're not even going to adhere to a cultural norm either, which I think is also really cool too. I've trained a lot of people that have bounced around, or military families have lived in lots of different states. They've lived in lots of different countries. They don't adhere to a specific gender norm either because they don't adhere to a cultural norm necessarily too. So I believe and aspire that in a globalized world and economy and culture, we can start to break down some of those societal habits I think we've had, where we decided, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 years ago, this is what you do based on what you look like. And I don't think that needs to be the case necessarily anymore. So I'm really happy you're doing a lot of this research on these topics. So hopefully shine a light that it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And here are some things that we can change potentially. So when you get to doing your research, who are you hoping to communicate with and talk to about it? Like what type of individuals are you trying to reach out to, and how are you thinking about conducting your research?
It's a very good question. So I'm going to be doing interviews. So how I'm going to do my research, I don't want to do something a lab setting. I want to do interviews. So I'm hoping to find both men and women across collectivist and individualistic cultures that have probably at least 5 years of negotiation experience. In different industries, I would really like to interview some executives, but as you know, there's also an interesting thing. Like these things we're talking about when it comes to like gender or being in confines when you start, one of the cool things about research is when you start, cool things about negotiation research is at a certain level you can start really kind of like shedding the effects of gender. So if you have a lot of negotiation experience as a woman, everything's even. There's no difference in gender anymore. So I would love to interview some of those women, and again, some of the men that have really been in very interesting, complex negotiations. I just want to hear what they've experienced, how they've experienced it. I can't wait. I can't wait for all those stories.
Yeah, I think maybe on that point, it might be beneficial to think about trying to get a swath of individuals that have relatively similar experience in relatively similar roles, but obviously in very different regions and cultures and countries and whatnot. Maybe a good way to think about it. Have you also considered within your research kind of splitting the whole gender thing, and also maybe potentially chatting with people that may consider themselves non-binary or transgender? I know those are those are newer topics, although people have been this way for a really, really long time. But I think we're more comfortable, or getting a little more comfortable, talking about these things as a society. I'm curious what that is like in 5, 10, 15, 20 years when these individuals are much more comfortable in business settings, and how that might impact negotiation perception as well. I don't know if we'll have a big enough data pool for that just yet, but it might be interesting too.
I love that. I would say if there's anyone watching who falls under that or knows someone, I would love to interview them. The more unique experiences, the more unique perspectives, kind of the harder the journey, and those are very hard journeys, right? Or from a career standpoint, I would say I would love to interview them. And I feel like it's very relevant data. And so it'd probably really make my research a lot more relevant.
Yeah, and I would also imagine, just based on sexual preference too, there might be, there's so many nuances to this too, right? I can be a hyper masculine female, and I might be negotiating with a hyper feminine male too, and that might impact how I negotiate. So that's why I agree with you. It has so much less to do with gender and so much more to do with societal norms or cultural norms or how I was raised, or maybe even what my own sexual preferences and how my own identity is as well. That's why I agree with you. We should stop talking about things like they're black and white. Things are non-binary, I guess, so to speak. And that life is just so much more colorful and so much more gray at the same time, that research like this, I think, is really valuable. It's much more long-term focus. It's much more real, practical focus, other than just lab environment theory. And I think and hope that a lot of people will get a lot of value out of the research that you're doing, Deven. So again, anyone here that's listening, anyone who's interacted with Aligned or seen any of our content, please reach out to Deven. You'll have, one, a fantastic conversation with her, but two, you're going to contribute to some research that we feel is going to be really valuable in the marketplace, because it's practical, it's nuanced, it's real. It's not about lab environment theory.
Well, thanks, Mark. It's been so great chatting with you. And the other shout out is, if you have a corporation or you really want your team to learn about negotiation and like the real world, not just this like transactional type of negotiation, but really like what is going to give you results in your team for a very long time, Aligned is a great partner to collaborate with and do the trainings. And I loved the trainings, and as a negotiation nerd, with all the literature reviewing I'm doing, I learned so much.
We love that. Deven Vespi, everybody, reach out to her, have her interview you, contribute to some incredible research. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.